Chapter 11 Strangers with Teeth. Xiao Xingden! Xiao Xingden staggered back, all senses assaulted at once, half a breath after stepping through the door. The first thing registering was the voice. One of the things that had always mesmerized him about Chiang Mai was the absolute, unbridled delight of his happiness, something bright and sharp and bone-thrumming, like the sun on the hottest days of summer. The second thing registering was that it came from face height, right in front of him. The third was an eager hand on his own, yanking it up to be pressed against a familiar chest, a racing heartbeat under his fingertips. Can you feel it? The same elation, laughter, and meanwhile he was still floundering, nowhere near caught up. A heartbeat under his fingers, and something more, just a flicker of that scorching sunlight and death, faint but unmistakable. A slow and unsteady swirl of cultivated qi, already strained from keeping the man in front of him on his feet. You rekindled it, Xiao Xingden. It never stopped burning after you left, burned right through, lit it back up. The chest his hand was so firmly splayed against, ribs more defined than he remembered, the heartbeat, the fluttering tendrils of rebound qi. It did burn, made his hand twitch, his heart twist, and with a forceful yank he snatched his hand back, as though scorched for real, shaking. The intoxicated laughter went silent in a heartbeat, leaving only rugged breathing, his own and Xu Yang's. Xiao Xingden? He had to take another step back, groping for the dorm frame to steady himself, the vertigo suddenly unbearable. Trying to manage the warring images in his mind, horror, guilt, affection, anger, the death sentence he should pass, should want to pass, should, but couldn't, was hard enough with the distance he had so carefully cultivated. He was in no way whatsoever ready to think about bodies and what those bodies had done, what he had done with Xu Yang. His knees nearly gave out and a hand caught his elbow, then immediately snatched back when he flinched violently. Daojang? It would have been easier, he was sure, to find the clarity he needed if there had been anything malicious or lewd about the voice, but Xu Yang sounded nothing but terrified. Xiao Xingden? Are you hurt? I'll get the doctors, stay here. No, he managed, fighting through the dizziness to straighten. Might find it hard to explain to the dignified older ladies why he would collapse, panting to his knees, because of a single touch from the murderer in their midst. It's fine, I'm fine. Don't touch me again. A sudden emptiness in front of him, space to breathe, the sound of footsteps retreating so fast they were all but stumbling. Go back to bed, he said, and managed to make it commanding, as though he wasn't still clinging to the doorframe like something drowning, like that command didn't make it all worse, his throat and ears suddenly flushing hot. You're burning yourself out again being up, walking around, let your energies rest. You need rest, Xu Yang shot back, and the childishness of the exchange made him burst into laughter, just slightly insane, breathless. I'll go rest. We can talk more later. There was absolute silence from the room, just a soft creak as from someone obediently settling onto the bed again. Xiao Xingden. He had rarely heard Xu Yang sound quite so bewildered. Supposed he couldn't blame him. He was still trying to catch up with, define what had just happened himself. You startled me, he settled for, which was a lot closer to lying than he was strictly comfortable with. Managed to straighten fully, let go of the carved wood of the door frame almost as an afterthought. I'm sorry, Xu Yang snapped out immediately, as though the words had been meticulously rehearsed, and he remembered their last talk, realized they might just have been. I didn't mean to. A beat of silence. Are you hurt? No, he sighed, shaking his head. No, I'm fine. I was surprised. When I have to react to too many things at once, it makes me dizzy. I thought you'd be pleased. Xu Yang's voice slid seamlessly from concern into an attack of accusation the moment he was reassured. I am, he said, because he mostly was. Xu Yang regaining his spiritual powers would be a lot more dangerous, but also a lot less dying, and there was little point in denying his own priorities on that matter by now, even after everything. Rest, Xu Yang, he repeated firmly. If you extinguish your qi again, it could destroy you. And then, because he couldn't help himself, don't do too much too soon. Sure, fine, Xu Yang said, and the fact he made no further comment made Xiao Xingjin realize that while the words had become a sardonic mantra to him, even Zijin, apparently the man who had first uttered them, was completely unaware of it. You should do your breathing exercises, he admonished, and was rewarded with a predictable groan. You want me to sit still and breathe for hours, Dao Zhang? I've already been in bed for days. You're just punishing me now. The voice was exaggerately injured. Neither Cheng Mei or Ah Qing had ever appreciated sitting for meditation or deep breathing for any long periods of time. But there was still just a faint tremor to it that belied the flippancy of the tone. Maybe I am, he said calmly. Do your breathing, Cheng Mei. It will help the flow of qi recover. There was a silence at that, longer than expected. Yes, Dao Zhang. The reply, when it came, was studiously meek, though there was something rather strange about the tone. Unable to read it, he just shook his head slightly. I will be back later. Yes, Dao Zhang. He could hear focused breathing as he turned to leave, deep but not calm yet, and decisively slid the door shut between them, a bit more firmly than intended. With the turmoil of memories deep, uncomfortable in his own guts, he could definitely do with sitting down and breathing for quite some time himself. What is he? Songlan had asked in a dark little shed 2 nights out of Yi City. Asked for the sake of the sleeping Xingjin, who was spiritually fragile but far too living for something dead. Ready to carve out answers that had surprisingly been freely given. Staring at himself in the basin's reflection, a dead body with someone else's eyes staring back, he wished he could ask as freely about himself. What am I? He didn't need to breathe, but still did, out of habit more than anything. The catch in half-dead lungs whenever his body shifted from running on air to thick resentment was unpleasant, like a moment of drowning. He didn't need to eat, but could. He didn't know if it was the lack of tongue or lack of life that made food taste little more than ash. Didn't need to sleep, but found that rest could still be pleasant, at least when not too deep for nightmares. A body moving, thinking, feeling, though it shouldn't be doing any of those things. There was an anger deep in him now, new and terrifying, a hunger for violence he'd never known before, starkly at odds with once so frost-calm self-control. Cold and dark and red-hot at once, brushing so very near the surface whenever the resentment was provoked, part of him now, being him at times. He was torn from his disconcerting thoughts by the sound of the door to their room's opening, and looked up to see Xingjin step inside, returning already. Must have been one of those more epic clashes, then. He had been gone less than the time it would take to drink a cup of tea, looking very flustered. He was never happy to see his companion upset, but couldn't help a small twinge of validation. Unable to hide his true twisted nature, Xu Yang was doing exactly what he had suspected, driving Xingjin further away with each passing day. Good. It would let his heart heal at last, allow him to cut loose, move on. He walked up to touch his hand. Hadn't been quiet, but Xingjin startled like a small animal spooked, stumbling back. Oh, he amended, 3 rapid breaths later. Zijin, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. His hand immediately rose, palm up, almost apologetic. He slowly took it, touch careful and light. "Are you all right?" "Ah, yes, it's nothing." One thing he had learned from the young guileless man from the mountain, among the first things he had realized when they first met, was that Xingjin was almost physically unable to tell a lie. Even deflecting a question made him look guilty, tips of his ears just faintly pink. What did he do this time? For some reason that just made the pink spread, and there was the slightest shiver to Xingjin's hand, as though he instinctively wanted to pull away. He could, at any time. He rested his hand in his by himself, but in the end he still let it stay. His spiritual power is healing. Earnestly sincere, but he still looked deeply conflicted, as though he was trying hard not to say something else entirely. Once he would have felt confident he could read the few unspoken things between Xingjin's lines. Now he was far less certain. He could tell one thing with regrettable clarity, though, and that was that cutting old hurts loose definitely wasn't an option yet. That might explain the distress, he concluded. They had agreed to track Xu Yang down and let things take their course from there, and considering what they'd found, Xingjin falling to pieces, screaming with grief at the sight of a coffin, there had seemed little point in making final decisions. Supposedly, with Xu Yang's strength returning, the time for those decisions was approaching, and Xingjin still wasn't ready. "I promised you once I'd wait for you," he thought, almost reproachfully. Didn't want to be any part of the reason why Xingjin should look so distraught. "Wait for however long you need." "An empty patch on the ground," he signed. "We'll make the future a spot where nothing is yet growing." Xingjin looked surprised, and then he suddenly smiled, and he wondered if he knew how radiant he was when he did. "An empty spot where the universe may plant a seed," he finished. Song Lan nodded, made the softest hum of agreement. "We'll take things as they come." Still smiling, Xingjin turned his hand, the way he had come to anticipate, appreciate, and squeezed his with endless fondness. Oh, Zijin. Only that, and he might think his heart was alive after all, brimming. "I was on my way to the garden. Will you meditate with me?" He said, turned the hand in his again to sign. "I would like that." He hadn't much liked touching people before, still didn't, not really, but it was hard to feel squeamish when you were the walking corpse in the equation. These light touches, to be able to talk to Xingjin, were more than worth any brief instinctive discomfort. And so, he didn't complain at all when Xingjin left his hand in his as they walked into the garden. This was one touch, one closeness he would never resent again. "Your nose is looking so much better already, Wang Daifu. I am so sorry for lashing out like that. I don't know what came over me." Xu Yang sounded not the least bit contrite, Song Lan concluded. Just sickly sweet, the usual two-toothy grin unleashed upon the taller of the two dignified women at the end of the table. Neither she nor the lady beside her looked very impressed with the apology, but Xu Yang seemed not to care one bit, only shot a pleased smile in Xingjin's direction, like a dog proud to have performed a particular trick. A week had passed since Xu Yang's qi began recovering, and Xingjin had thought it would be a good idea to share a final meal with their hosts before taking their leave, all 5 of them dining together. Song Lan was moderately sure he was a bad person for not trying harder to convince him otherwise. Xu Yang apparently had, he'd been told, but Xingjin was adamant they owed their benefactors to politeness, and once Xingjin truly dug his heels in, he was every bit as unmovable as the mountain from which he hailed. The mood was awkward, to say the least, which was unfortunate because he knew very well by now that Xu Yang considered silence a personal challenge to be met. "And your poor hand, Wu Daifu, you're still wearing the bandages. Make sure you exercise your fingers every day or they'll grow stiff in healing." "The food is good," Xingjin interjected, sounding like he was only now beginning to realize what a bad idea this had been. The shorter doctor smiled slightly at him, mollified. I'm glad you like it, Xiao Daozhang. You should eat your fill before leaving. Who knows how long the journey ahead will be? It is very good, Xu agreed cheerfully. Watching him eat was an experience, swift chopsticks in his once again gloved hand, plucking pieces one by one into that smiling mouth, like he was nothing but hunger. Something so thoroughly empty he would consume everything inside and still never come close to satisfaction. Salty, sweet, spicy, never the same thing twice in a row, a small pink tongue occasionally licking at his lips. And for a brief dark moment Song Lan yearned again to tear it out at the root. Tongue for talking, for tasting, for so indulgently doing all the things he would never do again. I wish to ask you for a favor, Xingchen said, delicately placing his cup back on the table. You have already helped us so much, and I would not ask for more for myself, but I think perhaps this suggestion might be of gain for you as well. Yes, Xiao Daozhang? Wang Daifu asked, sharp as ever, but curious. You spoke earlier of taking on more disciples, now that your Ali is old enough to take lessons. I met a girl in town. I know little of her, but she's helpful and well-spoken, and trying to look out after her brothers alone. If she is willing to learn, and you are willing to teach, it could be a beneficial agreement for everyone. Wu Daifu and Wang Daifu shared a thoughtful look. Your judgment is known to be wise, Daozhang. If it is your recommendation, we would gladly consider another disciple. The Dafan Wen path of healing is a rare thing these days. We owe it to our once teachers to pass it on. Xu gave a low, mocking scoff. Collecting more broken things already, Daozhang. Xingchen looked a bit hurt, but Wang Daifu turned her sharp eyes on him, somehow managing to make them sharper still. Ungrateful wolves are welcome to crawl back into the bag and be silent. Going from bored back to amused like a whiplash, Xu laughed out loud. I always did feel sorry for that poor wolf. He was just hungry. Most people can't imagine the things you'll do once you're hungry enough. Wolves? Xingchen asked, confused, looking like he had gotten thoroughly lost along the way. It's a well-known folktale, Daozhang, Xu elaborated, of a scholar and a wounded wolf. You've never heard it? Xingchen shook his head, still looking a bit left out. I don't think I have. Song Lan wished he had his voice, because he did know the story, and would have a lot to say about wolves and their ingratitude. He was not fond of the idea of Xu giving his spin to the tale. Luckily, he didn't get the chance. Wu Daifu might be the more soft-spoken of the two old women, but spoken she was, always enjoying the chance to tell a story. It goes like this. Once there was a scholar traveling down the road with his many bags full of scrolls, when he came upon a wounded wolf. She began, and her storytelling voice was captivating enough that even Xu remained silent, listening with glittering eyes, entertained. The wolf said, pitifully, Help me, scholar, the hunters are after me, and they're going to kill me. The scholar was a good man, and couldn't stand the thought of leaving the wolf to his fate, so he thought quickly and emptied one of his bags of scrolls, and told the wolf to hide inside. When the hunters arrived, he pretended never to have seen the wolf, and they rode on. Song Lan couldn't help but glance at Xu whose head tilted bonelessly to the side, an odd little half-smile on his face between bites, amused by some private joke. Once the hunters had left, the scholar let the wolf out of the bag and made to continue his journey. But the wolf said, You saved me from my enemies, now you must save me from my hunger. The scholar apologized and said he had brought no food along. The wolf only laughed and said, I only eat fresh meat, scholar. If you don't let me eat you, can you really say that you have saved my life? Xingchen listened attentively, and though his face remained calm, his fingers twitched a bit. The scholar argued that he had only acted out of kindness to save the wolf, but the wolf said the act of kindness was incomplete if he would let him starve to death anyway. In the end, they agreed to consult 3 elders on who was in the right. They asked an old apricot tree who said humans would take and take, Even when offered all fruit from young branches, they would still demand every bit of timber in the end, and it would only be right for the wolf to eat the scholar after all. The room was silent, everyone listening with rapt attention to the familiar tale. They asked an old cow, who said the same thing, that humans would demand calves and milk and hard work, yet finally slaughter a loyal old cow for meat, and that it was only right for the human to get eaten. The wolf was pleased, but the scholar reminded him they must ask one more elder for advice. "I must say I admire the wolf's patience in all this," Shi Yang interjected, but fell dutifully silent after another glare by Wang Daifu, allowing the other woman to go on. They met a peasant and asked him to give final judgment. The peasant was clever. He declared he could not believe the scholar had saved the wolf the way they said. Surely a wolf could not fit in such a small bag? He asked the scholar to empty it out again, and the wolf slid back inside to prove how it happened. "And then they beat him to death," Xu Yang laughed. "That poor wolf! All he wanted was a meal, and he got a hoe to the head until his skull split in two." Everyone aside from Xinjin gave him angry glares for interrupting, and he just smiled back, delighted. "A cautionary tale about ingratitude," Wang Daifu snapped, "and about showing too much kindness to those who seek to take advantage." "A cautionary tale about helping strangers you find in a ditch by the roadside, Dao Zhang," Xu Yang said, and his voice was honey and something darkly bitter. "Some of them come with teeth." Xinjin sat silent, head bowed, as though struggling with what he wanted to say. "I still think the scholar did the right thing," he said finally, almost defiant. "It would be wrong not to help those in need. Not everyone needing help is a wolf." "Most are," Xu Yang said, but he had finally put down his chopsticks, leaning forward as though hungrier for Xinjin's words than the food. Xinjin raised his head, scowling, eyeless gaze fixed on Xu Yang steadily enough that he actually started to look uncomfortable. "If you start debating who is deserving of help and who isn't, then perhaps no one is. Or you simply choose to believe that everyone is. I believe that. If I found a stranger in need of help by the wayside, I would help him, if I had to make that choice, again." Xu Yang slowly went pale and almost visibly shrank back, avoiding that fixed, blind gaze. "Then you haven't learned anything," he muttered, but thankfully those were the last words out of him all evening. Dinner turned out a much more easygoing affair after that. Somehow Sung Lan found himself made to promise to write letters, and Xinjin was drawn into a lengthy discussion about healing herbs and spiritual infusion. Xu Yang didn't pick up his chopsticks again. If anything, he looked vaguely ill. Xiao Xingjin appreciated the silence on the way back to their rooms, almost dared hope it wouldn't be broken. But he could all but feel the tension in the air, and wasn't at all surprised when Xu Yang spoke up once they were alone, held back a sigh and turned to listen. "You really did mean what you said before, Dao Zhang?" The voice was odd, thoughtful, accusing, and disbelieving at once. "That if you could go back, you'd still save a stranger by the wayside?" "Yes," he said, unhesitating, but allowing that sigh out. "I couldn't not." "You'd get hurt. All you cared about would get hurt." "Only if the wolf chose to bite." An odd, slightly longer silence. "It's a wolf. Biting is what he does." "People aren't wolves," he said, suddenly tired of word games and allusions. "They make their own choices. I can't control someone else's actions, only my own, and I would choose to help." "They killed the wolf anyway, in the end," Xu Yang said after another long silence, and if he didn't know better, he could believe the voice to seem somewhat hopeless. Perhaps just letting it die would have been a kindness. "Rest, Xu Yang," he said, tiredly, turning away to leave for his and Sijin's rooms. "We're leaving early tomorrow." Thankfully, his only answer was silence. The three travelers left while the sun was still newborn in the sky, cool mists swirling, the town only just waking. The two elderly doctors remained by their gate, watching the odd trio make their way down the street. "Well, there go 3 disasters if I ever saw any," Wu Lian said cheerfully, as soon as they were out of earshot, rubbing her hands against the morning cold, trying not to disturb the bandages. "Best of luck to them. How long do you think they'll last?" "I'm more concerned for the world they let loose upon myself," Wang Meili huffed. "I hope we didn't do anything we'll regret in helping them." Wu Lian laughed and elbowed her wife in the side. "This is the most fun we've had in ages, and you know it." That earned her a reluctant smile. "I'm looking forward to the letters, I'll admit, if the news won't reach us as rumors of disaster first." Laughing again, Wu Lian hooked her arm around Wang Meili's elbow. "Or that, yes. Come, love. I want to reread the tragedy of Yi City that Song Daozhang wrote down for us. What a treasure, that man, to be able to listen to stories over and over long after our guests have left. I hope his letters will be as captivating." The taller woman's smile grew wider, though no less sharp. "I think we'll need to throw out the entire medicinal inventory from the sick room first. I do not trust that guest not to have meddled with the labels." Far down the street, the 3 travelers disappeared into the mists, casting long shadows as they went.